Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to explore apocalyptic doomsday thinking. With me is futurist Tom Lombardo, who is the director of the Center for Future Consciousness. He is the author of Future Consciousness, The Path to Purposeful Evolution. Some of his other titles include The Evolution of Future Consciousness, Mind Flight, A Journey into the Future. He is also an expert on science fiction and has several forthcoming books on the history of science fiction, which we're going to draw upon in our discussion today. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you, Jeff. Nice to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you. The classical story of Doomsday and the apocalypse is in the biblical book of Revelations, but you point out that it actually has its origins in the writings of Zarathustra.
Yes, correct. Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, seemed to have articulated all of the main themes which occur in the book of Revelation. The Battle of Armageddon, the conflict between a very powerful good spirit and a very powerful evil spirit, the coming of a Messiah, the millennium that would follow, the ascension into heaven of spirits, of individuals who followed the good spirit, descension into hell for the ones who followed the evil spirit. So the basic scenario appears to be created by Zarathustra or Zoroaster back in 700 BC.
And I know from previous interviews there are different dates about some historians would argue that Zarathustra goes back thousands of years even before.
Yes, I've read that too.
Before that time. So it's one of the primordial myths of humanity.
Yes, definitely.
That we are in some sense headed for an enormous conflagration. And I think many people accept this today as literally true.
Yes, and it has been something anticipated, expected throughout human history, not just simply today. It keeps getting retold in different eras, and there are even people who embrace the idea and are looking forward to it and think, in fact, it would be a good thing for it to occur.
It would be a good thing because it would mean the return of Christ or the establishment of a new kingdom of heaven. Or
the wiping out of all the evil and terrible things going on in the world today. There are people who are of an ecological, environmental bent who feel as if we are the scourge of the earth, the disease on the earth, and that such an event should be encouraged and facilitated to wipe the slate clean so that, in fact, we can get rid of this nasty disease that is human civilization that we have created.
And this is a theme that's been taken up a great deal by writers of fiction.
Yes, for sure. Definitely for sure. A classic early example in quasi-science fiction was The Last Man, written at the beginning of the 19th century by Granville. And Granville provides what is probably the first personal narrative of somebody going through the demise and ending and destruction of the earth and of human civilization. And though he combines theological as well as scientific ideas in creating his particular blend of it. But in science fiction, it's an idea that repeatedly occurs. I think humans, to some degree, are obsessed with the idea as almost like an archetypal primordial nightmare.
Well, I know that biblical scholars tend to look at the book of Revelation in the context of the era in which it was written. And they often say that this is actually not a description of a future time, but they're writing about the oppression of the Roman Empire at that time. And the possibility of, the politics of that day. And yet, people today seem to think it's speaking to us now. In almost every age, they thought the book of Revelation was in reference to them.
Yes, because just as a speculative hypothesis, the human mind has the inclination to interpret its present reality as some type of fundamental moral struggle between forces of good and forces of evil. We can plug in different historical governments and historical figures, and that there needs to be some kind of war where good will defeat evil and defeat evil in some final fashion. H.G. Wells, in reference to World War I, called it the war to end war. But then he was rather disappointed because it wasn't the war to end war. Okay? But he saw it that way. Because after the Battle of Armageddon, or whatever, or the Armageddon-like battle,
the final battle,
there will be an era of world peace, which is the millennium, the prophesied millennium, which is in St. Augustine in the 4th century A.D., and then continues on forward. So there is this belief, this kind of strange optimism that such a battle would lead to a better world. And it aligns with the philosophical idea that every step forward, every movement into increasing happiness and order has to be preceded by some monumental type of chaos. And in our case here, the Great War. The problem, though, is that we always end up, this kind of an image ends up as a happily ever after image. So after the big battle, we're going to live in paradise, but then what happens?
Well, for 1,000 years, maybe.
Then we ascend into heaven. But it's a happily ever after. It's like, we're going to have this terrible event, and once we have this terrible event, which is a great cleansing, then there's no more fighting, no more war, and then it's going to be peaceful afterwards.
Well, there are completely dystopian versions of the apocalypse, are there not?
Oh, yeah, there are. Yes, there are dystopian versions, which would be where we have the great worldwide war, civilization is destroyed, and we retreat back into some form of barbarism and a much lower form of civilization, and maybe or maybe not there is any way out of it. That's the Mad Max scenario. That's the Boy and His Dog scenario. A comical version, but a really good version of it, is the science fiction novel A Canticle for Leibowitz, where we have World War III, which is an atomic war. We go back to a more primitive form of existence. We spend 2,000 years building it all back up again. And what do? We start World War IV. And at that point, humans leave the Earth because the Earth seems to be hexed. So you can't have dystopian versions, but I think the religious versions tend to take the view that the great final battle will be followed by some type of ideal human reality, and it fits into the notion that increasing order has to be preceded by chaos, but then it becomes a happily ever after that it's not going to happen again.
And you seem to find that quite dissatisfying.
I find it very dissatisfying. Yes, I think that it's sort of like an end of time scenario. It's also very unrealistic to suppose that humans could achieve some kind of ideal existence that would be static and that would not lead to further difficulties or turmoils down the line. Yeah.
And it also seems to glorify war.
Oh, it does. It glorifies war tremendously. Because the sad truth is that the good guys use the very same kinds of means to defeat the bad guys that the bad guys are using. So how can you tell who are the good guys and who are the bad guys? Since it's not like the good guys use moral virtues to defeat Satan. They use more powerful physical forces to literally obliterate the negative. It's like in Star Wars, we have the Force and there's the dark side and then there's the good side. But the good side uses weapons just like the dark side does. Yes.
And I suppose you could even describe Star Wars as a kind of apocalyptic scenario in which the evil empire has to take over in order for it to be overthrown.
Yes. In fact, one of the another thing to throw into this, one of the great, in fact, perhaps archetypal space operas in science fiction was Doc Smith's Lensman series, which was written during beginning in the 1930s, and he kept doing it up until the 1950s at least, or maybe the 1960s. And what Doc Smith adds into it is the conspiracy dimension. Now, imagine we have two powerful forces. Now, they're aliens in this case, one of whom wants to help man to reach some higher, better level, and the other is bent on man's destruction and decay. And so everything in human history is a consequence of these two powerful alien forces who are manipulating what is occurring down below. Now, that is no different in fundamental conception than Zarathustra or Zoroaster's notion of two powerful spirits manipulating human history, or the Christian vision of God and Satan attempting to manipulate human history. So we add in here this conspiracy notion that behind the scenes, behind all the things that are going right and all the things that are going wrong, there's something powerful up there which is actually moving the chess pieces around down here. And then in the end, the good guys, in this case here with Doc Smith and space opera, it's going to be the Lensmen together with the good aliens who eventually defeat the bad aliens, but they defeat the bad aliens by blowing them all up in the end. The Armageddon scenario does have that kind of paranoid conspiracy theory element to it, on top of the fact of it having this belief that somehow there's some kind of final battle that could produce indeterminate peace and tranquility in a utopia afterwards.
And these myths or powerful stories.
Yeah, they're myths, yes.
They have real social consequences.
Of course they do.
Today, I recall years ago, Ronald Reagan had a Secretary of Agriculture who was against any form of ecological conservation because he said, doesn't matter, we're going to have an apocalypse soon anyway.
Yes, right. I make the statement at the beginning of my science fiction book series that science fiction is the most influential contemporary form of futurist thinking. But I use the word contemporary because I convinced of the opinion that there are more people in the world who are influenced by the classic religious myths about the end of the world or what the way the world is going to go in the future than are influenced by science fiction. And that has been and still is the dominant mode of thinking about the future, coming out of traditional religious thinking. And what psychological research would indicate is that optimism and pessimism have self-fulfilling prophecy effects. That doesn't mean that if I think things will go great, they necessarily will, or if I think things will go bad, they necessarily will. But we increase the chances of the thing we anticipate happening by virtue of believing in it. We increase the chances. And so having an obsession with a great battle to be fought between good guys and bad guys, where the good guys and bad guys are actually rather ambiguous, and the other side thinks that you're the bad guy and vice versa, that is increasing the chances of that kind of a reality coming to pass. And that's what we struggle against. We struggle against that powerful, deep-seated archetypal myth. And by myth, I don't necessarily mean anything derogatory. It's a fundamental, deep story that we believe in about the nature of reality or what's going to happen.
Well, Joseph Campbell seemed to believe that these myths are really about us.
Yes, they are about us. Yes, right. And in fact, you could even say that the good spirit and the evil spirit are psychological projections of what humanity sees inside of themselves. And Freud would have said that, in fact, or Jung would have said that it's simply the projection out there into metaphysical space or outer space of the sense in which we see an evil side within us and a good side within us who are at war with each other. So we put it out there with the hope that in the end the good side is going to win and it's going to eradicate the evil side.
Well, I know, I believe it was in the 1930s, Jung wrote an essay that fascinated me a great deal, in which he observed the dreams of his German patients. And what he saw was that the German god of war, the ancient Teutonic god of war, Wotan, seemed to be appearing in these dreams. And he predicted on the basis of that there would be a war soon. And indeed there was.
And it doesn't surprise me. If an idea, a theme, circulates around in enough people's minds, in dreams and in conscious states, it primes the pump. It does all kinds of things to move events in a certain direction. There is the argument presented that it was all of the future war stories written between 1870 and 1910 in Europe, hundreds and hundreds of them, very paranoid stories about invaders coming from across the channel or from some part of Europe, that primed the pump for World War I. Because it got both sides thinking about ways to be more protected, or increase their military power, and see the other one as somehow out to steal their territory and diminish their power. So people have said, in future studies, it is said that the best way to predict the future is to create it. Now, in science fiction, you don't, besides saying that science fiction may predict the future, you could even say that science fiction has a role in creating the future. So our images of what we imagine to come in the future will actually prime us and sensitize our consciousness and our behavior to facilitate the realization of those things.
Or, of course, it could go the other way, that the dystopian visions of the future might motivate people to change their behavior.
Yeah, they might motivate people to change their behavior, except for this. It also seems to be the case from psychological research that if you are pessimistic, it makes you dumber. and it makes you more depressed. And therefore, if you're in a state of fear and apprehension over the future because you think bad things are going to happen, you're not going to be as psychologically capable of finding solutions to the negative anticipated events as an optimist. Because even though it's frequently said that pessimists are more realistic than optimists, the fact is that's not true. Optimists are more realistic than pessimists because pessimists are by nature afraid of reality. They see negativity, so they draw back. So if I throw you a warning, yes, a warning can be a good thing. But if I continually obsess over how the world is going to hell, it can't help but depress me. And psychological studies show that you're smarter and more creative and more perceptive when you're in an optimistic, upbeat, emotional state.
And I suspect in the realm of science fiction, you've got cases, I think of a few actually, where some of the more negative writers end up committing suicide.
Yeah, so Granville committed suicide a year later,
or they died early of illness.
Yeah.
Like,
well, they could, yeah. And I'm a firm believer in the reality of psychosomatic human reality, that our minds have an impact on our physical bodies. Science fiction writers, in being dystopian, I'm sure a lot of times want to raise issues, to raise our consciousness, to get us to see where we're going, and perhaps to thoughtfully consider whether or not we should head in that direction. And H.G. Wells was very good at doing that early on in his writings. But then H.G. Wells attempted in his later writings to try to create utopian images of the future. Now, presumably, this is funny, but his earlier stuff, which was more dark and destructive, was seen as better literature and was much more popular than his later stuff, which was more utopian and more along the lines of preachiness. And so he's more remembered for The War of the Worlds and The Island of Dr. Moreau and The Time Machine, where you go ahead in the future and we're all gone, and the Eloi and the Morlocks and all those negative images, then he's remembered for the Food of the Gods, and for The World Set Free, and for Men Like Gods. Although they did make a movie out of The Shape of Things to Come, but they left an awful lot out of that when they created that. And he did end up depressed, to some degree at least, because he felt disappointed in that his optimistic and constructive visions were not taken seriously enough by the world population and by government leaders. So I tell people this, and this is very simple. If you dance with the devil always wins. And so if you swim in the darkness eats you up. And so it's important to cultivate and realistically cultivate, and it's hard to do this, but that doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. All things excellent are as difficult as they are rare, said Spinoza. It's important to cultivate bright images or positive images and work at it, because it's going to elevate you physically, psychologically. It's going to spread out. It's going to make you better at dealing with problems, and it collectively make people better at dealing with more global problems. Neil Stevenson, who was one of the great contemporary science fiction writers, is part of a group of science fiction writers that he initiated to create more optimistic visions of the future in science fiction, because people in science fiction and outside of science fiction have complained that most of the science fiction that gets written is dystopian, you know? there's an element of truth in that, but then I guess there's an element of truth in the fact that disaster sells better than paradise. It attracts the human attention more.
Well, it may have something to do with the age in which we're living.
Yes, it may have something to do with the age in which we're living. But every age has felt like Doomsday was right around the corner, you know, and then there's another, then the sun rises tomorrow.
Yeah.
Yeah. But we are dealing with a very powerful, deep-seated, archetypal narrative here that influences us and influences too many people too much, and it would be good if we could create, in spite of our fear, a more constructive, evolutionary, and progressive image that didn't reduce to everybody having more gadgets and cars in the garage. Something a bit more holistic than that.
Something holistic, and I suppose it means breaking free from the kind of trance-like hypnosis that these apocalyptic visions have on us.
Right. Yes. But there's definitely something powerful at work there. Because it's been with us for so long, you know. Yeah.
Well, I guess it's something inside of each and every person. Well, Professor Tom Lombardo, once again, a fascinating discussion.
Yes. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you for being with us.